The Drums of War, Chapter 36, Extraction. On the forge world of Babylon, Private First Class Peter George exhaled. He sent a bullet sailing through the heavily polluted air in the industrial park from his concealed firing position. The bullet accelerated through a long series of magnetic rails, had been sent on its way for a very important meeting 4 clicks away. Private George had heard that snipers in the ancient Terran wars would leave behind a brass casing of their rounds when they eliminated a target, so that the enemy would know that there was a sniper had escaped detection. But his munitions lacked any such casings. He knew that the lord inspecting the new power armor production line was about to have a high-speed connection with his hunk of tungsten, but he followed his training and watched anyway. He knew that MH would not like the smile that curled his lips as the black priest lord's head became a spray of pink mist. The priest lord's face didn't even register the small red hole in the center of his forehead. He sighed as he slung his rifle over his back and crept deeper into the maintenance access tunnels and started making his way through the twisting warren of disused access areas for forgotten systems. If not for his anti-personnel rifle, he could have walked the streets and therefore gotten to his next target more quickly. Lance Corporal Y11 had gotten made. The warriors were being more vigilant, and his network of turncoats and dissidents told him that the capture of the traitor serial murder had set the entire planet on edge, more than he or the other ADS Corps troopers had managed with the assassinations in the past 2 weeks. Apparently the rumor amongst the warriors was that none of them could fight so well as Lance Corporal Y11 had, and that the vengeful Goddess Republic's hand used her terrible power to transform a human to look as they do. Well, the rumors were closer to correct than they knew. A more wholesome grin spread across the scarlet-dyed face of Private George as he once again imagined the Republic as some kind of goddess. Just wait until they see the statues of Lady Justice, he thought to himself, as he soundlessly lopped through the forgotten valve manifold room. After 40 minutes of moving thus, he saw what he was looking for, writing on the wall in symbols to indicate administrative space. He breathed deep through his nose and leaned his anti-personnel rifle up against the wall and let the breath out again, along with all his feelings of how the wretched society was run. Then he pulled a smart key from a pocket in the middling personal servant's garb he wore and unlocked the door. He stepped into what was probably considered storage, insofar as dust-caked objects upon the dirty shelves were stored there. It had likely been so long since any of the items were wanted that the room itself had been forgotten, briefly remembered by the slave tasked for cleaning the floor as he or she looked at the door and label, and then once more lost to apathy of the downtrodden. Even so, Private George pressed an ear against the door for half a minute before he punched in an equally forgotten override code to open the inner door. The Exarch Dominion was like a hermit crab, sheltering in the shell of a long-dead creature, and devouring and decaying flesh of some great beast to keep itself going. Private George wondered idly whether any of the Exarch realized that they were squatted over the bones of a fallen civilization. He wondered whether they were allowed to realize it. It mattered little. He had a job to do. An acolyte lord needed to die, and more importantly, he would have Lance Corporal Y11's location in the documents passing through his office. Private George put his curiosity about these slaves and their masters aside and found a stairwell. The grab lifts wouldn't be operative to slow down. Up, up, up. He silently loafed, and occasionally passed slaves dressed like he was, or in garments more faded and frayed, scurrying along on their various errands with eyes downcast and shoulders hunched. Private George found imitating the posture distasteful. It was necessary, though. He had seen on his earlier deployments other ADS troopers walk with straight backs and clear eyes, and been made to fight and kill to avoid capture. It had nearly made intel gathering activities impossible. Nearly. Today, though, Lance Corporal Y11 made a small error of letting one of his sources see where he had set up his base. He forgot that some of the turncoats and dissidents are so desperate to escape a sacrificial altar, there was very little they'd balk at, and betraying a foreigner to the authorities carried tempting rewards. Well, the Exarch Priestmaster of his AoE was probably leaving him with some reminders on OPSEC. The slaves on errands grew thicker as Private George ascended higher, and slowly began to be intermingling with the initiate highborn. who strode through the sea of inferiors with the very beginnings of self-possession and command. The vast majority of them would never be anything other than an interface for the higher nobility and the slave population. Those who rule can't be expected to lower themselves to speak with those born to serve, after all. Private George tried not to think on that detail, lest an angry snarl contort his face from the blankly servile affection he masked himself with. Passion was something people noticed, and that would be counterproductive. There was an initiate highborn waving a datapad around in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other at a group of simpering slaves. They bowed their heads, made obeisance, and said soothing words in brittle, placating tones, all while the man raved about getting into contact with a long list of initiate highborn who would be needed to deal with the assassination of the head of the Power Armor development. The shouting man didn't seem to care that this was the first any of his subordinates had even heard of the situation, so his counterparts from other areas were likely not yet informed. Then he didn't notice when Private George deftly plucked the datapad from his fingers as he made to hurl it behind him. Private George kept walking with the datapad as if it was his errand to deliver it to someone deeper within the administrative center, and entered the grav lift. The other passengers braced themselves for the acceleration, and Private George did too, so as to not appear uncommonly strong, as the doors closed. The grav lift capsule shot upwards at the speed which most Terran children would consider delightful, but apparently the Exarch administration staff found uncomfortable if mundane, and expressed to about midway up the building, some 200 floors in around a minute. The stopping lifted everyone's feet from the deck. Then some muttered oaths as they lost their footing or dropped the effects that they had been tasked to fetch. Private George strode towards the office in the back corner through a honeycomb of desks and a soft partition workspace that hummed with the activity of administrating to logistical concerns. Nobody stopped him. All assumed that he was just another slave sent to deliver a document, news, invitational, some other such thing personally. Another cog in the machine turning for the glory of the bloodthirsty god. More fool them. He punched in that same long-forgotten override code to the office door, and when it slid open, he strode in, and let the facade of a subservient slave fall away like a dirty cloak. The door slid shut behind him, and the acolyte lord commanded, "Leave it on the table, there by the door," without looking up from his computer displays. Private George let the datapad clatter to the floor and crossed the intervening space between the door and the desk, before the acolyte lord could look up in surprise at the noise. He drew his RNI-issued combat knife from his hiding place in the folds of his disguise as the acolyte lord's surprise was still turning to anger, and plunged its tip into the administrator's throat, and out the other side. The cry of shock, or maybe pain, died upon the blade as it was torn forward, and the man fell from his chair, clutching at his slit throat in a vain hope to keep his lifeblood inside himself. Tears welled up in the acolyte lord's eyes as Private George strode around his desk to stoop over and clean the sanguine life from the cold steel on the acolyte lord's fine clothes. Private George thought he'd tried to say something, but there was only a wet gurgling and the bubbling spray of blood from the dying man's slit throat. Private George admitted privately that he didn't particularly care what a slave driver's last words were. From the intel he'd gathered, this particular acolyte lord had prided himself on keeping most of his work between his ears. That is, being able to recall information when wanted without searching out where it was, and getting the correct people into contact to keep things moving by simply remembering. He hadn't bothered to compile any of that knowledge anywhere. Well, that expertise was leaking out on the floor, along with the man's last moments, as Private George started looking through reports and requests for where the RNI brother was being held. He found the relevant information, found an I/O port, plugged his SSD in, and transferred it. Then he simply walked out the office and put his hunched, servile mask on once more. It wouldn't take very long for the body to be discovered, but there were advantages to looking like just another faceless cog in the machine. Once he was back in the maintenance spaces again, Private George slung his anti-personnel rifle over his shoulder once more and started making his way to his hidden base. He knew where Lance Corporal Y11 was, and Lieutenant Winters would want to start sketching out an extraction ASAP. With a little luck, they wouldn't have to wait for the public execution to make their move. With a little luck, all the work the ASD Corps was doing would bring the enemy to surrender a little sooner. On Zer, Aidan Purefoy leaned against the wall of what he'd come to think of as an apartment. In truth, it was closer to a cell. A bare cot in a dingy 8x8 room with little in the way of comforts. It didn't even have a window. Aidan found himself fingering his mother's rosary, though he couldn't remember any of the prayers that went with it. He found that it reminded him of home. It reminded him of what his war of words was trying to protect, the freedom to forget the prayers. The people of this industrialized world didn't even know that such a freedom was possible, or at least they hadn't. It had been difficult, and more than a little dangerous. A crash course in Exarch language made it easy enough to understand what the Xenos said, but to speak it was a different question. In the beginning, he was met with suspicion from the slave classes he spoke with on account of the thick accent he spoke with, an obvious sign of an off-worlder. His first week had been devoted entirely to staying just one chance turning ahead of the authorities. Other missionaries, both religious and philosophical, had failed to do so, and had become martyrs for their causes. The Catholics loudly denounced Auxerre as a false god as they burned. The liberals proclaimed that false belief was valueless belief amidst the flames, and the Protestants praised Jesus for allowing them to display their faith. Aidan wasn't surprised. There had been frank discussions on the necessity of martyrs before the missions began. All had agreed that refusing to bend to Exarch's gentle ministrations of their instruments of pain and painful death would go a long way in exposing the enslaved to an alternative way of thinking. Aidan was of the opinion that such examples would only work if there was some living missionaries to explain the martyrs. Hence, the week of frantic running and hiding. There, in that run-down and abandoned sleeping cell, he cast his mind back to the second week. A week of listening and hushed practicing. It was as if he was one of the famed Republican advanced stealth drop surveillance scouts of the ADS Corps, slowly gathering vital information for his next move. Except for the fact that he carried no weapon and very limited provisions. His food had run out by the third week, except for the crayons, but even the RNI they had been made for don't call emergency rations food. Instead, he'd gone for local stuff by means of somewhat dubious methods at first, such as taking advantage of the apathy of the food distribution slaves and simply joining various meal queues, with the help of the Digitan comrade. He'd gotten a hold of some access codes and printed himself a few ID cards to access the food more legitimately. This had made his work much more effective, with the combination of access to high-quality food and an accent that made him seem as though he was merely born off-world rather than just landed. He was able to begin speaking about the ideals of the Dominion. In the beginning, he was merely asking that a devastatingly dangerous monosyllabic question, why? Though in this language it had 3 syllables. He would hear the "May the Emperor victory come swiftly" and ask the devastating question, or perhaps someone would praise the Empress for meager rations dispensed by other tired slaves. He'd ask, why? Or perhaps when that infuriating religious refrain, "May the stars tremble at his step," he asked the speaker why the stars would tremble for anyone. It was dangerous, more dangerous than his accent had been, and he had been forced to run and hide to keep from becoming another martyr more than once. But slowly, he was building a network of questioners. Even so, it was time. Time to leave the mission and return home. Aidan wasn't a religious man, but he found himself fingering his mother's rosary and hoping that if there was a God, he'd bless the operation to extract him from Zer. He'd also harbored the hope that the score of people he'd convinced that questioning things was now one found out the truth would keep their courage and spread the questions. Maybe they'd be brave enough to question what gave the so-called initiate highborn, the acolyte lords, the priest lords, and the priest masters the right to command them, even to a sacrificial altar in the name of a god whose thirst for destruction and violence cannot be sated. Back on Babylon, a local day later, about 23 hours, Private George concealed himself on the maintenance platform of an antenna of some sort by means of adaptive camo setting of his power armor. Lance Corporal Y11 was being held in the squat slab of concrete below, which only gave him and his fellow Overwatch snipers excuse to bring their anti-material rifles. He loaded a magazine of HPST rounds, preferring to eliminate targets, while most of his squad mates had gone for the HPF rounds for a more general suppression effect. Private George preferred to kill as few of the warrior slaves as he could manage. Then again, none of his squad mates could match him for accuracy. In any case, it was T-minus 30 seconds, and Private George's thoughts were completely consumed by the data from the infiltration team and his helmet's HUD. He had 15 shots in the magazine and had selected 15 targets for elimination. "You sure Lance Corporal Francis Bahagamabo?" asked over comms. "Have your walls for a shot at this one," he explained, and one of marked targets flashed on Private George's HUD. "Check the order," Private George said. "Target 13, Lance Corporal Bahagamabo murmured. "Really? You're not keeping your last 5 free? I can cycle a mag in under 3 seconds." "Just mark the target earlier in the queue," Sergeant Jean-Marie Marcel Nudard gruffly ordered, and Private George's senior teammate grumbled about cocky kids as he did so. Lieutenant Winters broke in and said, "The assault team moving in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!" Private George had already lined up his first shot and keyed up the hidden camera helpfully placed there by an infiltration team. He fired and lined up his second shot as he watched his target's head become so much pink mist in his peripheral vision as he took his second shot and keyed up the next camera. 3 shots later, and he had keyed up interior cameras of the next shot to anticipate the panicked movements of the enemy, who had just realized that they were being sniped through their fortified position. 15 shots, 15 kills. His teammates offered their compliments over the comms, but Private George ignored their praise. They still had a brother at risk. There would be time for celebrations after he was safe. Private George was as good as his word. He had cycled in a fresh mag of HPST and shifted his aim to cover the assault team, who were cutting their way, by means of combat knives, sidearms, and power armor, towards the cell where Lance Corporal Y11 was being held, and very likely subject to what the barbarians thought was interrogation. The infiltration team had drawn their sidearms and were eliminating further targets closer to the target area. Through a combination of penetrative radar, tracking beacons, and his squad mates' power armor, hidden cameras, and helmet cameras, Private George selected targets that posed a threat to the assault team. He and his fellow Overwatch teammates broke the resolve of the warriors resisting the assault team before he had emptied half of the fresh magazine. Therefore, he began selecting targets who threatened the infiltration team. This was more difficult due to the lack of helmet cameras. Still, though, he emptied his second magazine without missing a shot. There were more compliments over the comms, but Private George was too focused in scanning through the hidden and helmet cameras for potential threats as the infiltration and assault teams rendezvoused and pulled Lance Corporal Y11 out of the cell. Once the 2 teams made it outside the building and were quickly carrying the battered servicemen between 2 of the infiltration team members, Private George acknowledged some of the praise. "Thanks, but I'm just doing my job." "He's right," Sergeant Nudard snapped. "Time to change position and cover the retreat. How about off this rock is waiting 8 clicks out, and the enemy won't stay blind forever." "Aye, Sergeant," came the reply from the Overwatch team. Meanwhile, on Zer, Aiden sat in the forgotten warehouse space with the Digitan transport unit and waited. The smugglers from the Coalition would be there soon, and he had to trust that the work he did was enough. He had to pray that it was enough. "How was it for you?" he asked as a means to break the silence. He could have checked the readouts for the transport unit to see how many entities were inside. "Bad. The digital sapiens didn't develop any emotional processes, so the only thing I could use to convince them was bare facts. Most of them saw continued existence without the ability to fulfill their original directives as undesirable," Rain said through the unit speaker. Two digital sapiens, whose functions was to gather and organize information, have agreed to come with us." "I'm sorry," Aiden said awkwardly. "It's okay. They're not like you, or even like us. Without their builders, they're not even complete. We don't understand them, and they don't understand us. It's been humbling. How about your hearts and minds mission?" "I built up about 20 core questioners that I'm pretty sure could hold to their commitment to freedom under, well, the threat of being immolated? Yeah, that," Aiden said, as he once again fingered his mother's rosaries. "I didn't expect to see you again, Rain," he said suddenly. "Me either," she replied frankly. "I was resigned to a lonely trip home." "Why did you think I'd make it? You didn't seem very confident." "Huh." Silence stretched between them once again, filled only by the distant hum of industrial activity. "Do you think you'll volunteer for another mission?" Rain asked suddenly. "I don't think my heart can take it," Aiden said quietly. "I saw the sacrifices too." "Children, Rain." Children. I know. I saw, Rain said consolingly. At least Aiden thought it was a consoling tone. He appreciated the attempt. I spent this mission encouraging these people to question their status quo, and now I'm questioning things. Such as whether pacifism is really the most moral stance. Am I really moral for standing by and watching his murder is played out right in front of me? I don't know, Rain admitted solemnly. Me either. I can't go on another mission without a firm foundation of my own. I can't promote principles I don't believe them. Makes sense, she replied. I still think it was brave of you. It's a lot harder for organics to hide in a place like this. Thanks, Aiden grunted. 1 minute. You should be able to see the shuttle if you look outside. Local radar is picking it up, and I have it on cameras, Rain said quietly. You should get all the way in that unit then, Aiden said, as he let himself sink more deeply into the questions. End of chapter. I'd quickly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.